Did you see the selfie in Auschwitz?
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, it's everything that you dread, right? Young person, seemingly clueless about where she is and what's going on. No historical context, no understanding. Her name from the beginning, right? From Princess Brianna, right? You immediately assume, like, oh, of course, the princess doesn't quite get it. She's got her earbud dangling out of her ear. She's like listening to a soundtrack while she's walking through Auschwitz, listening to her tunes. And the response is to smile. Naturally, this created a bit of a controversy, right? Thousands of people said this is an outrage. Does she have no sense of decency, no sense of decorum? Does she not understand what was going on there? It's like the worst of the next generation. All of our fears realized in one photo. 2,000 retweets on a pic that wasn't supposed to get this much attention. And how did she respond? I'm famous, y'all. Making it even worse. I was called by CNN, and they said, what do you think about this? How would you comment as a theologian and someone who's interested in communication? What would you do with this? I happened to be in Germany at the time that they wrote me and had just taken my kids to some of the museums, like just the day before, to walk through some of these things in Berlin and surrounding areas. But I decided before I responded that I would try to go deeper and understand more of the backstory. Why was she there? Why was she walking around? What was she looking for? And this is what emerged. She said, yeah, I do understand what happened there. I studied it for years with my dad, and we always planned to visit there, but he died. Huh. So this was a life goal for her, to get to Auschwitz, and to get to Auschwitz with her father, and to walk through that experience together. Now the strangeness is, why is she smiling, right? But I think for her, it was a way of kind of communicating across that chasm and saying, Dad, do you see me? I made it. I finished the trip that we talked about. I did what we wanted to do. I walked through that thing that we studied together. This was a way to communicate even amidst grief. And nobody understood that. Nobody knew what to do with that. And to me, this is the starting place for my latest research, because that post that I wrote defending Brianna got more comments and more discussion than anything I'd ever written in my entire life. So there's so much confusion, so much tension around these issues, so much misunderstandings across the generation. I was like, let's lean into this mess. Similar thing happened here. Did you see this picture? So here's young people gathered in a museum in Amsterdam, and there's Rembrandt's Night Watch right behind them, and what are they doing? Looking down, backs turned, ignoring the masterpiece in front of them. Again, people are like, oh, I can't believe this generation. Stupid kids. Don't they know what art is? Don't they know what a masterpiece is? Well, it turns out they do, because their teacher had asked them to respond and to post something online about what they had just seen. They were doing the assignment they were told. They weren't ignoring it. They were responding to it. How much more do we need to do in terms of understanding the full picture surrounding some of the things that we misunderstand? Now, it's not to say that there aren't problems, right? So here's a selfie at the 9/11 memorial, and she hashtags it hungover. Here's some gentlemen outside the Anne Frank house, and they want to talk about their band, Dungeons of Rap. Highly inappropriate. No sense of digital decorum. Here's a young person who took a selfie with my teacher while she's having contractions. Kind of funny. Somehow I don't think he got an A for that day, you know? If you've been to the Louvre, you've seen people crowding around the Mona Lisa not to take a picture of it, but to take a picture of themselves with the Mona Lisa. Very strange to have your back turned to the Mona Lisa, to have an experience of the Mona Lisa. USA Today said if you could put one invention or innovation back in the box, what would it be? What do you think they said? The selfie stick. Number one. Exceeding nuclear weapons. More hatred of the selfie stick than nuclear weapons. And the salad shooter. Yeah, salad shooter's somewhere up there. Around 5% on the salad shooter. Clearly, there's a lot of hate wrapped around selfies. And I mean, I've had that feeling myself, where I've been a tourist in Grand Canyon, and I'm like looking at tourists doing stupid things and, you know, taking pictures with buffalo and endangering all of us. But I want to suggest that there's maybe a thin line between love and hate. So can we learn how to love the selfie, or to at least love the selfie taker? Because surely that is our call. And I understand there's a generational gap. Here's a good picture of it here. So here's a gentleman in here in the bathroom, in the men's room, washing his hands, and he's like, why is this young person taking a picture in the bathroom of themselves? Why is there a peace sign, right? It's like all the questions are right there. Why is this the moment? None of it makes sense. So I decided to wade into this mess by taking my training, my PhD in theology and culture from Fuller Seminary, and I said, I'm going to study selfies as a way of trying to get inside this problem where so much hate, so much confusion resides. My publisher actually asked for a bit of a sequel to iGods. It had sold very well, it had sold better than any book I'd ever written, and I think it's because it was timely. It was about these powerful forces, but you know, for my kids, they're actually not that interested in these things. This isn't where they reside. This isn't where they spend their time online. For them, these are the powers that be. This is where they live online, between Instagram and Snapchat. So I decided to go further and try to enter into their world and let them be an expert and train me in how I need to think about this. I'm not even the best selfie taker in our family. My wife is really the best. She has much longer arms, so she has much better reach, better sense of framing. One time I did take a selfie on vacation. My daughter took a picture of me taking a selfie because she thought it was so strange. Like, what are you doing? Do you know how old you are? Do you know how weird you look? Stop that before you embarrass us all. In our work at the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, all of our psychology is narrative driven. It begins with this question of what's your story? And so as a filmmaker, that's how I start. As someone who's going to write a fictional story, I'm going to start with a character and try to figure out what's their story. If I'm going to do a documentary, I'm going to ask people, tell me your story. What's your story? So that's what I want us to do tonight, is to kind of think about the story that exists outside the frame, beyond the frame. We talked about doing dual listening, and in therapy, right? Dual listening, particularly in a narrative frame, you're not just listening to what people are saying, but you're kind of trying to listen what's going on beneath the story, right? In counseling setting, you don't want to just take what they're telling you, but also try to think a little bit deeper about it. There's certainly selfies that I see that, they kind of make sense. Like, if you had Bruce Springsteen pointing right at your camera, I would take that picture. Right? That's a good moment. That's a selfie-worthy moment. If you were at the Oscars with all of your best friends, why not? Right? Everybody gather around. Let's remember this moment. If I was on a spacewalk, I might take a moment and say, you know what? I want to remember this moment. I'm going to take a selfie as an astronaut. Isn't that wild? When I saw this selfie, I actually thought about the scriptures. I thought about how we're placed in Psalm 8, where it says, when I look at the heavens and the work of your hands, the moon and the stars that you have made, what are human beings that you're mindful of them? Children of the earth that you care for them. You've created us a little lower than the angels and crowned us with glory and honor. Those are the kind of moments you can have here in Malibu, right? Looking up at the stars, pausing, putting yourself in perspective. And isn't that to some degree what this astronaut's trying to do? He's trying to grasp the majesty of the moment. Who am I? How am I in this place? And where is God in the midst of all of this wonder and creation? Now, lest we get too high and mighty about what we're capable of, I want to suggest that others can take selfies as well. And lest you think this is a one-time thing, here's another day. Kind of same characters involved, same cat. Really a good selfie taker. Even made sure that they're all kind of in the frame, right? Kind of like, hey, Max, move in a little to the right, a little to the right. Okay, perfect. Got it. I think selfies are great for peak experiences, right? There's moments in life where you want to mark things. And you think about the Bible, right? There were peak moments in the Bible where they created that Ebenezer to mark that moment. And it's good to say, yes, in this place, I was with God and God was with me and we were wrestling and it was glorious and it was amazing and I want to remember. I want to mark that moment. There's others who take these peak experiences a little too far. There's a group of young people in Russia who climb buildings just for the selfies. This is, I think his name is Sergey, is that right? Yeah, this is his girlfriend who goes on the journeys with him. And that's a little intense, don't you think? Why would they do this? Why would they do this? Amongst young people, they say they do it for the gram. They do it for the Instagram. It's worth the risk for the sake of the shot. Climbing atop in Abu Dhabi, I think. You can get into some dangerous situations with selfies, right? That's not the time. It's not the time. Now you might say, well, maybe he's looking for the exit, right? He's kind of studying the map and trying to figure out how to get out of the ring. I think I'd focus more on the beam than the picture, right? At those kinds of moments. Here's someone going into a live volcano. And they're like, I'm just going to turn my back on the volcano here for a minute. Kind of grasp the heat. This guy took a picture. He wanted to take a picture with his hijacker in a plane. He was like, can we get a picture just real quick? Just want to remember this moment. That's not wise, right? That's foolish. That's foolish behavior. So I want to suggest that perhaps the greatest danger that selfies pose, though, may not be to our bodies, but rather to our souls, to our psyches, to our very selves. I think this is a question that hovered over all of my research. I wonder what kind of questions go through our minds as we post a selfie and put ourselves out there. So many young people forced to deal with these questions. Do people like me? Do they really care? It's a bit of a daily referendum to put yourself out there, right? Am I beautiful? Am I beloved? Am I worthy? Does anybody truly see me? It's tough to submit ourselves for this kind of public scrutiny and commentary, because people can be incredibly cruel to each other, especially online. And thank God that we didn't have selfies back in the day, right? I wouldn't want to put myself out there for that kind of judgment. So can we enter into this process with them? I was always worrying about my hair, my how I looked, whether I had a zit. It's a tough time to be a teenager and now to have to grow up in public. Really, really tough. Interesting, when it comes to social media worries, right? I worry about the negative effects of social media on my physical and mental health. Mature people, 15% are worried about it, 22% of boomers, 37% of Xers, almost 50% of millennials worry about their own physical and mental health when it comes to social media. That's interesting. They're more worried about it than we are, to some degree. They're feeling those effects. And the research is still coming in. In Britain, they asked people 14 to 24 whether these things had an impact on their well-being. And look at how Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook might affect issues of sleep, the fear of missing out, bullying. Interesting, notice body image is much higher. Worries about body image are very high on Instagram. We'll maybe talk some about that why that's more worrying than other things. Issues of anxiety, depression, loneliness. And yet at the same time, same study, they found that it also helped people in terms of self-expression, self-identity, a sense of emotional support, even community building. So how do selfies build community, right? That's kind of antithetical to what we might think. Even awareness of other people's health and real-world relationships. We discussed that a little bit this afternoon, our sense of proximity when we're seeing other people, our sense of the world beyond ourselves. So, I think this is a key question. Why do we make images of ourselves? Because if you think back, right, even at an early age, we all did it. So what's going on there? What is this impulse? What drives us into self-imaging? Even from an early age, right? We're sort of the object of people's attention at birthday parties and that type of thing. I decided to, again, go back into Genesis and try to think through this issue of self-imaging. Where does it stem from? Who was the first self-imager? God. God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. The tripartite emphasis, right? God created in the image, he created, he created, he created. What is it about God that God said, I want to make an image of myself? That's fascinating, isn't it? This drive to post selfies could be rooted in God. It's very strange, but we don't really think of it that way. Michelangelo did a great job of kind of portraying this kind of divine handoff of sorts. And of course, what's the Latin for the root of all this? We've preached on this, right? The Imago Dei. It's the ground of really so much of what we do. The beauty, the worth of people across cultures, across race, across economics, across the planet. What kinds of problems arrive when we don't see ourselves and each other as created in the image of God? I could have given much more political speeches up here over the last 2 days. How many of our political problems are rooted in this? What if we take this issue, right, into issues of immigration, issues of police violence, issues of Me Too? Aren't almost all of these things kind of rooted in a lack of understanding about the beauty and the worth of each other? Can we recover the Imago Dei as a way to help us navigate this really complex time of misunderstanding, of fighting, infighting, political attacks on each other? Does this sound like something worthy of paying attention to? Right? Suddenly it's like, oh, wait, selfies get me to this? That's a very strange way to think about it. And of course, selfies, and our self-image can be silly at times, right? So here's Calvin says, made in God's own image, yes, sir. And of course, God must have a goofy sense of humor, right? We do a lot of things that are embarrassing, that are strange, a lot of sinful behavior that is hard to excuse. It's interesting to what degree the Greeks were in touch with this. They had their own stories, right? Who are we looking at here? Narcissus, one of the foundational stories of Greek mythology, Greek and Roman mythology. I don't know that there's that many parallels today. I don't know if if you look at the political landscape, it doesn't really seem like there's a lot of parallels to what's going on. And just to be equal time, President Obama also had this famous selfie. Where was this selfie taken? Do you remember this one? It was at a memorial service for who? It was Nelson Mandela's funeral. So here's 3 heads of state taking a selfie, and what's Michelle thinking? You know what? My mom taught me, and you don't take selfies at funerals, No, that's wrong. That's wrong. Artists have painted the selfie and Narcissus over time. Here's Caravaggio. St. Catherine of Siena thought a lot about Narcissus's problem. She said, if he's wise, he'll be moved to love the water rather than himself. For had he not first seen himself, he could not have loved or been delighted by himself. An invitation to kind of see through. Who's enabling you to see? Who's giving you the gift of sight? Who's giving you the gift of life? Credit the Creator. Don't fall in love with the creation. And of course, as we extend out the story, who else is in the story? Often forgotten. Echo. Echo was right there. Echo wanted a relationship with the boy. She was in love with the boy, sought relationship. And yet her curse, right, was to be unheard. She tried to reach out to him, and all she could get was his words echoed back to her. That's all she could summon. And so she dies and withers alone. And he dies and withers alone. Doesn't even bother to feed himself because he becomes so self-obsessed. And so the possibility of relationship, the possibility of what we hear about in Genesis is broken. And I wonder what the implications are for us today. Mother Teresa said the biggest disease today is not leprosy or tuberculosis, but rather the feeling of being unwanted. And surely that's what Echo must have felt like, as her overtures were rejected by a self-obsessed boy. John Milton said, loneliness is the first thing which God's eye named not good. That was the breach. That was the break. This was the promise, right? To be in relationship with each other. To not be alone. To not be alone. Even when you look at Andrei Rublev's notion of the Trinity, right? You see that interrelationality. A three-way conversation between Father, Son, and Spirit. And selfies at their best, I think, become these moments of communal celebration, right? Like graduations, or wedding anniversary, family reunions, a gathering of friends. Hopefully, in studying our selfies, we start to see the beauty and the wonder that reside within all of us. So it's not that Narcissus had the wrong idea. We are fearfully and wonderfully made, but he forgot to credit the Creator within that process. As I thought about selfies, thought about the Bible, I decided to maybe go back and study the history of self-portraiture. So we have this notion of God making a portrait, in a sense, via us. Unfortunately, Moses didn't have a selfie stick, right? Had something that he could have taken a picture with. But yet somebody did write it down, right? So it became text rather than image to tell that story. But some of the oldest imaging, self-imaging in a sense in the world, was done in ancient Egypt. And it's interesting when you look back on this, this was for atop those kind of mummies, right? So they're wrapped up underneath, and then they would put the image of the person on top. And the distance between them and us doesn't even look that great. Here's a young boy, died early. What do we notice in these paintings? What stands out? The eyes are so strong, yeah. No smile. What else do you notice? What'd you see? Notice all the jewelry, all the decoration? Who could afford to commission a portrait like this? Only the wealthy. Only the wealthy could afford to have their portrait prepared so they might live on. And so we have images like this of queens, right? Who do we have here? Nefertiti, right? Legendary beauty by which others have been measured in the centuries since. She could afford to have her portrait made. Her image is preserved for history. I found this interesting. American Society for Plastic Surgery using her image. I don't think she's getting royalties from that. And then you have the Greek versions, right, of ancient beauty here, the Venus de Milo. And where does she show up? The National Capital Society of Plastic Surgeons. Ancient images of beauty that still carry sway today, where we're still having to kind of measure ourselves against this. Well, this is the ideal of beauty. And the pressure that comes from this kind of imaging and this idealizing of certain forms. Nowadays, you see apps that young people can buy to alter their image. Maybe make their skin lighter, put a little gleam in their eyes to change their appearance. Kind of scary to see the rise of plastic surgery that has accompanied the beginnings of the selfie movement. As people are able to alter their image, they often feel the need to change that image. And it's not just women, it happens to men as well. I personally, my abs never looked like that. Not one day in my life did I ever look like that. But there are apps that you can download. Yeah, no, look it up. Look it up, right? They'll give you abs, they'll give you muscles, they can boost your muscle. You can even get tattoos, right? Simple way to add that stylish tattoo. Interestingly, researchers who are looking at ancient portraits and how those have influenced us, they've discovered that they weren't white originally. There was color, there was pigment involved. And only now we see it as this kind of gleaming white. And so the overwhelming whiteness of kind of the Greek world can kind of put pressure today on what the standards of beauty are. And so you see something like this and you're like, oh, I'm never going to be that white. I can't do that. But maybe if you see the colors at the time, it would change your sense of what is beautiful, what is strong, what is magnificent. Again, Catherine of Siena said, what is it that you want to change? Your hair, your face, your body? Why? For God is in love with all those things, and he might weep when they are gone. How to recover this sense of the beauty and wonder of God. This is maybe the first self-portrait that has still been preserved by an artist, Jan van Eyck, Danish painter. I think this was done in the late 1400s. And it's interesting, why did he paint this? Was he trying to study himself? The nomenclature on the top and the bottom actually suggests that it was a bit of self-promotion. He was actually saying, hi, my name is Jan van Eyck, and this is what I can do. Which is another way of saying, this is what I can do for you. Hire me, and I will paint your portrait. This is early advertising. This is self-promotion that we now look back on and say, wow, that's genius. It's beautiful. It's amazing, and the artistry is amazing. Why? Yeah, if you had that headdress, you'd be like, I'm going to paint that, right? That's really pretty impressive. Why was there an explosion of self-portraiture in the Renaissance era? What changed to make it more possible? How was he able to create this portrait of himself? Technology changed. Mirrors became perfected in Murano, Italy. And so suddenly, artists could see themselves clearly for the first time. Technology is what enabled an explosion of self-portraiture. And so you have a young artist like this. This is Parmigiano. He was 20 years old when he painted this. And it's not on a mirror. It's a flat canvas, but he's trying to make it look like a mirror. It almost looks like a selfie the way he has his arm elongated, isn't it? He's playing with perspective. He's playing with technology at age 20 in this self-portrait in a convex mirror. How about this portrait? Do we know this one? Right? Velázquez was commissioned. He was the Spanish royal painter Who's he supposed to paint? He's supposed to paint the king and the queen. He's painting the royal family. Where are the king and the queen in this portrait? They're in the mirror, in the background. He's playing with perspective. He's playing with this new technology. He's showing everything that happens, right, on the other side. See him way back there? That's the royal portrait that he gave them. And in the act of doing that, in a sense, he was calling attention to himself and saying, look at this great trick that I just played. This is one of the greatest portraits of all time because I figured out how to flip the frame using this new technology, like a self-reflective mirror. How about this? Where's this? Have you seen it in the Sistine Chapel? Michelangelo's Last Judgment. What's in that circle right there? Do you remember this? Literal skin without bones. Historians believe this is Michelangelo's self-portrait. This is him saying, hey, this is where I'm headed. In fact, this is where we're all headed. So let's measure our days. Let's think about eternity in a different way. Really, really smart way of thinking about self-portraiture. And then this one. What do we have here? That's Caravaggio doing David and Goliath. Who's Goliath? Caravaggio. It's a self-portrait. Someone who was in touch with his awfulness, someone who knew he was a murderer, someone who had a lot of sins to atone for, portrayed himself in this way. Again, St. Catherine says, if you dwelt in self-knowledge alone, you would despair, like Caravaggio. But if you dwelt in the knowledge of God alone, you'd be tempted to presumption, like many people we know. One must go with the other, and thus you will reach perfection. Who's the greatest portrait painter of all time? Probably Rembrandt. Here he is as a young man, and then in middle age, and then later in life. Self-reflection, something beautiful, something important about that. Can we invite young people at this age to think about their selfies over the next 20 years or 40 years, to take stock and to think about the state of their spiritual being as well as their physical being? Can we invite them into this kind of artistic process? What have you noticed about all the portraits that I've shown so far? Who do they feature? It's all men, right? These are male painters. Where are the women? They weren't allowed to have the brush in their hands. They weren't given the education. They weren't allowed into the academy. Now we're in an interesting moment where for the first time, to some degree, women have the power to control their own image. And at this moment is when we're saying, you know, all this self-portraiture, it really looks narcissistic to me. Is it maybe leaning towards our misogyny as much as anything else rather than narcissism? I don't know. I found one artist in the past. This is Artemisia Gentileschi, whose father was a painter. And so he taught his daughter the craft. And she was a pioneer. And it was not easy navigating a man's world. She suffered a lot. There was a lot of abuse. She was rejected in so many areas. Her biography is loaded with pain. And yet the beauty of her work endures. This is called self-portrait as an allegory of painting. And so she paints herself in the act of creation. And look at the mastery that she displays there with all the tools at her disposal. She's able to create an image of herself, the artist in her element. This is radical self-representation, circa 1600. How different might art history look if the paintbrush was put in more women's hands? How different would these issues of objectification and the Me Too movement be if women had been able to control their own image across the centuries? Here's a remarkable painting by Carrie James Marshall. What's the problem with the fill-in-the-blank painting behind there? As she goes to paint herself, what is she lacking? There's no black paint. She can't paint her skin because she doesn't have the colors at her disposal to do that. Isn't that the story for so many people who don't find themselves in art history? Right? Either they didn't have the paintbrush, or if they did have the paintbrush, they didn't have the colors. It was an unacceptable color, unacceptable image. I wonder if a deeper appreciation of selfies could renew our affirmation of everyone's God-given dignity and worth. Is this a way forward? We say, Van Gogh, it's so brilliant, it's amazing, he was so complex. We don't say he was a narcissist, we say he was trying to understand himself. Can we do the same thing with my friend Camille when she takes a selfie? Can we do the same thing with Cheeraphone and her friend here, Nicole? They take images of women in Africa as part of their work to try to elevate women. They create beautiful portraits of the women that they're serving to help them see themselves differently and to feel a different sense of power. How about this group? They titled this post, "No Gang Signs, Just Degrees." You could look at these young men and say, well, those might be gang members hanging out in a corner. Or they could be 5 of my students from Pepperdine on the day of their graduation, celebrating. One of the assignments I give my students is to reclaim masterpieces for themselves, understand the use of color, the use of light. And so this was Alex's work. I love this one, rooted in this painting by Renoir. I want my students to have a sense of artistry and to feel the power that resides in this phone. The ability to control their image, the ability to express themselves, to lean into that God-given power of self-imaging. Look at the complexity of this. Love this portrait by a student from Pepperdine. KK calls this color me in. Color me in. Thomas Merton says, for me to be a saint means to be myself. The problems of sanctity and salvation is in the problem of finding out who I am and discovering my true self. Photography is a young art form, and we've always been trying to figure out how to take better pictures. Dorothea Lange said the camera is an instrument that teaches people how to see without a camera. Can we challenge people to develop a more holy sense of calling within all this? To be able to see themselves in everyday life, even in a distant mirror, inside a store, inside a frame, inside of a reflection. Paul McCartney fiddled with it. This photographer was never famous in her lifetime, only after she passed away. They discovered thousands of portraits taken by Vivian Maier. She lived an anonymous life, and yet she was studying herself, studying the city, studying our dual nature. Cindy Sherman said, I'm tired of Hollywood defining us and putting women in peril, objectifying us. And so she would cast herself in various things where it's like the skillet is about to stab her, like women are always in peril when it comes into Hollywood. She pushed back against that. Robert Mapplethorpe, as a young man, Robert Mapplethorpe facing an early death from AIDS. Can we explore our shadow side in our selfies? Can we explore the dark night of the soul? I believe a healthy selfie recognizes the beauty and the pain of what's happening. So how can we use and lean into selfies today? researchers at BYU, they said there's three main ways that people are communicating via selfies. Some people view it as communication, some people are blatant self-publicists, and some people are approaching it as autobiographers, documenting their own life. And there's such a range within that. How do we help people lean into the possibilities? Who's the biggest self-publicist of all time right now? Right up the road here in Calabasas, Kim Kardashian. She works hard to put her image out there and to become a social media influencer. She's been surpassed by her stepsister. This is Kendall Jenner. This is the most liked image on Instagram of all time, 3.2 million. And she influenced a whole bunch of other girls around the world who said, I want to be like Kim. There's also a guy who said, he set himself up as if he was her stepbrother, and he calls himself Kirby Jenner. And so he posts himself into her selfies as a way of taking the air out of it. It's tough for young girls, I think, to have to compete with supermodels. There's a lot of Insta pressure that comes from putting yourself out there on Instagram. You're literally trying to compete with the famous, with people who have set decorators and designers and makeup, and yet millions of girls engage in this every day. Donna Freitas talks about the happiness effect, how social media puts this pressure on us to be perfect. And so even somebody like Taylor Swift, right, with her cat, she's just deliriously happy in this picture. And so the pressure to be happy at all times comes across for young people. It's not enough just to smile. You have to really, really, really smile. What do you do in those days when you don't feel like smiling? So even when you might be amidst grief, you find yourself smiling, even when times when it might be inappropriate, because that's the only sociable offering. This is a social media influencer who decided she was tired of the pressure, and she went back and talked about what she was thinking in each of her pictures. She says, I had acne here and a lot of makeup. I was smiling because I thought I looked good, but happiness based on aesthetics will suffocate your potential here on earth. Can we encourage a more imperfect selfie? I believe that Snapchat was a response to the perfectionism of Instagram. It was a self-correcting thing that young people said, I'm tired of having to always look perfect. And on Snapchat, the images go away. So I could be goofy, I can be silly, I can let my hair down. And so it was a natural correction. And so for people who want to communicate, Snapchat is actually, I think, a very effective way. You can be playful, you can be silly, you can face swap at the British Museum. You can make fun about being randomly selected as you go through the line. You can offer a more honest selfie, even if you're a supermodel, even amidst pregnancy. You have people like this, makeup artists, hair artists, who say, you know what? That's one kind of airbrushed image, but this is what I really look like on those other moments. We need much more of this, and can we encourage this within our churches, right? There's a lot of perfectionism that comes with church. People feel pressure to put on their best self, and yet we want them to be able to be honest about who they really are. How do we make space for people to let their hair down, to be more Snapchat than Instagram within our congregations? J-Lo has the airbrushed perfection. This is how a mom says that she feels on any given day about her and her kid, right? That's a family portrait I can relate to, right? With a couple of kids. Somebody's always crying. It's hard to get the perfect shot. This idea of being honest about who we are and where we are, I think it goes back to the Confessions of St. Augustine. This chance of just saying, honestly, this is what's going on with me. How do we make room for autobiographies like St. Teresa of Avila? The Puritans did it, right? They were engaged in this kind of diary keeping where they were taking stock of their daily life and their daily spirituality. So can selfies can social media become a form of that kind of taking of stock of spirituality? And then the third group is autobiographers. And there's moments, right, when you're atop a mountain where you say, yeah, I'm going to capture that. When you have somebody like this with you, you want to take a picture with them. If you're hanging out with a koala, you want that moment. That's a beautiful moment. Selfies and social media are this kind of record of our sojourn on earth. And so what do we do with this? All the pictures of food, what's that about? What's that about? Could be a way to mark that and say, yeah, this is a beautiful meal. I want to remember this moment. I think it could be almost a form of prayer. We pause before a meal and say, thank you, God, for our meal. The next generation pauses before a meal and takes a picture and says, this is beautiful. What I'm about to receive is utterly beautiful. We don't call it prayer. They don't call it prayer, but it is an act of recognizing the bounty and the gift before us. It's a way to say, I'm blessed. So somebody like Ann Voskamp talks about 1,000 gifts and gratitude and marking our life by putting beautiful things, ways that we appreciate God's provision and gifts on any given day. I mean, that is beautiful in and of itself. So what do we do with this notion where we're altering ourselves? What do we do with this idea of people trying to make themselves more beautiful? I think these are aspirational selfies. I took one as a young man. I did not know how to play guitar when I took this picture. But I imagined myself as playing guitar someday. It was a way, I learned. So this selfie was a projection of who I hoped to be. So what do we do with young people? This is one of my students at Pepperdine May. And I don't know what to think about this exactly. I had to think about this a whole lot. Like, what is the scriptural response to trying to change your image? To maybe not being satisfied with who you are? Where do we see that in Scripture?
Not being satisfied who you are?
No, a sense of a foretaste, perhaps, of glory divine. Right? This was a sneak preview of who Jesus was becoming and who we are becoming. It's very confusing, right? But they had this kind of transportation to a higher plane. They kind of got out of their everyday life into a higher sense, a taste of heaven. They saw, in a sense, that he's the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation, the image of the invisible God. We looked at this icon, right, that captured the complexity of life in such beautiful ways. I want to suggest that selfies could be a search for God via God's image, us. Can we encourage young people to take their best selfie, right, on good days, on bad days, to see themselves as beloved by God, precious in His sight? And can they understand the power of self-determination, the power of self-expression contained in this? My Selfies book contains in each chapter a selfie challenge. And so I ask people to take a selfie that expresses how they're feeling, how they feel about God, how they feel about maybe a dark spot in their life. Would they want to dress up as who they want to be? Different ways of thinking about how they could chronicle their spiritual life via selfies. Few questions to consider as we wrap up tonight. Have we been too quick to judge others' self-expressions? Can we see the taking of selfies as rooted in a longing for love and a search for God? Can we learn to see through the image that people are projecting? And can we approach our smartphones as a paintbrush, as a tablet, an opportunity to develop our God-given creativity and to express the glory of Christ's kingdom? Yeah.
For a brief time in this presbytery, we had a thing where we all took selfies in groupies.
Really?
And hashtagged it, We Are Los Ranchos.
That's pretty cool. How'd it go?
I started it, so you have to ask somebody. I thought it went well. Yeah.
That's pretty interesting. Yeah. That's a beautiful, proactive response. Yeah.